Hi, it's Mike from Pro Tools Expert, and we're down at Jigsaw's new HQ in Golden Square in London, and I'm now joined by Walter, who has just come off stage giving us a presentation about composition. Now, you're the composer half of the duo. Andy, we spoke to, is the mix engineer, so you're the guy who has to come up with the creative brief, the ideas. So give us a sense of how you start that process, because presumably you get some sort of rough cut picture with some dialogue, you must have conversations. So how do you go from that blank piece of paper to starting to produce the composition?
It's a very good question. So very often I get to start with a QuickTime. Sometimes it's very rough and there's no special effects in there. You can see the main actor in front of a blue screen doing weird gestures, and afterwards we see there's a mountain in the back and he's just jumping off a cliff or something like that. And then I have to read the script to make sure I fully understand the story. And then I would kind of lock myself into my studio, start writing and come up with a few ideas. At this stage, usually there's a bit of temp score in the film, so the director and producers would give me a rough indication of what they're after.
So what's a temp score for those that don't understand the terminology?
Yeah, temp score is kind of music that they've heard on a different film that could be in a similar genre. So it makes sense to listen to the temp score to get a feel for, like, if someone tells you it should feel fast, what is fast? If someone is used to heavy metal, it's probably faster than someone who's listening to quite slow-paced, easy listening music. So we all have a different perception of speed and of aggressiveness in terms of in terms of instrumentation. So we would use that as a rough guideline for the emotions that the producers want to evoke in each scene.
And presumably, do you compose scene by scene, or do you have a sort of theme that you then sort of evolves scene by scene? How do you take it from there?
Yeah, usually producers and directors are quite keen to listen to the main theme or hear a main theme very soon, very early on in the stage. But I usually try to kind of calm them down and say, come on, give me a week or two just to fully understand the brief and fully understand what we're after. This is the stage where I play around with electronic music, electronic instruments or kind of recording instruments live, just to find the balance, to find the essence of what the producers are after, what the director wants me to deliver.
So presumably you're effectively getting a palette of both style and also composition and arrangement and emotion. Obviously, with the whole thing about film music, is it's designed to amplify and to reinforce the emotions.
Exactly. This is the moment where the temp score is falling short, because it's been written for a different film with a different emphasis on emotions. And so I take this as a rough guideline, but I come up with my own ideas, instrumentation, with my own kind of way of leading to climax and, getting my own crescendos going in the music and those things.
And how do you struggle with the fact that the way the film is cut may not fit into nice 4-bar, 8-bar patterns and sequences, and there are certain key hit points that just don't land on the beat? Or is it a matter of that's where you tweak the tempos until things do land on the beat?
If you had a look at the Logic session, I'm using Logic as my main sequencer. If you had a look at my sequencer session, you would see many tempo changes in there. And especially when a locked edit never is a locked edit, it changes quite a lot. So then you have to redo the tempo maps to make sure that you're hitting the same cue point again.
So presumably with Logic you're using a lot of VIs. Are you using both the VIs in Logic or are you using other third-party plugin VIs?
A mixture of both. I have to say there's quite a few really good instruments and effects in Logic, but I usually use quite a lot of outboard.
So what sort of outboard instruments are you using?
So a different kind of plugins I'm using is Universal Audio. I've just got a new quad interface, the Thunderbolt 2, which is amazing, all the plugins there. I still use a bit of Wave, and indie kind of developers like Valhalla, there's an amazing reverb they produce.
But in terms of virtual instruments, when you're using electronic instruments rather than recording real instruments, what sort of virtual instruments do you turn to?
Virtual instruments, quite a lot. There's anything from, gosh, on the orchestral side, it's easy to say. There's everything from East-West to Vienna Symphonic Library, VSL. There's Project Sam. There is pretty much anything that's out there. So in terms of electronic instruments that I'm using within the sequencer, there's quite a lot of a different assortment, from Omnisphere Spectrosonics to Ropapen to Moog replications by Arturia to all different sorts of instruments. There's new ones that came out from Output Sounds.
The
Rev and Signal, which I'm using, and I very often, because these sound so perfect, I often use a chunk of that and then time stretch that or edit that with my own effects, just to give it my own kind of vibe and my own touch, my own kind of interpretation of the music.
And so how much, presumably things like the strings are there purely to work out what the score has to be. Presumably most, if not all, films that you do, those string samples will be replaced by real strings recorded in a studio?
Most of them are. At some point, I chose not to replicate. Most of them will be replaced, but some of them, sometimes I decide not to replace them if either the articulation is very specific for a sample, or sometimes I want to layer them back. So to use the live recorded instruments and the samples.
So you actually keep the samples in and layer those in with the real instruments to give an even thicker texture.
Yeah, sometimes, especially when it goes quite epic and quite big. But whenever we do something, whenever I'm doing something more on the intimate side, like sparse orchestrated, probably string quartet and piano, then it's 100% replacement, as this is something that you can't really get with samples.
Yeah, you need the real instruments. Yeah, no, I totally get that. And so presumably at some point you need to create a series of WAVs and stems which you can then hand on. So presumably you just bounce out WAV files from Logic to hand it on?
Yeah, I usually do kind of stereo bounces of the music, as in as many stems as we need for the next process. If I know that, for instance, Andy is taking care of that, we have kind of our way of naming files, so the time code would be in the file name to make absolutely sure that it can't be placed wrong in his Pro Tools session when he takes over. And yeah, there's quite a few stems usually. There's strings, the entire cluster section, from strings, brass, woodwinds, percussion, additional drums, electronics, split into synthesizers as in terms of live recorded synths, or maybe some pads and electronics and arpeggios. So as much as possible so that the mix engineer has the best control over the score.
And so presumably how much changes do you find you end up having to do, where the picture, as you talked about earlier, the picture is never locked?
Yeah.
Do you get involved in having to do some readjustments, or is it tend to be the domain of the music editor to resolve those little challenges?
Very often it's the music editor, but I usually get quite hands-on in those changes, because sometimes you want this to sound as good as possible, and just a simple cut very often just doesn't cut it. So you have to do it yourself, and then I would have to, again, go into the score sheet and make sure that either I change a few notes, move that to the left or right if I can, or do a few tempo changes, or maybe rewrite an entire scene, entire sequence to get to the cue point.
Yeah, so that you get the hit point bang on.
Yeah.
And you say you work in Logic. Has that been just something that you've got used to over the years? Have you tried other platforms? Is this your comfort tool? I mean, Pro Tools is my comfort tool. I don't mind admitting it. Have you looked at other devices? Because presumably you found, if you tried Pro Tools at all, do you find it not as a composing tool?
Yeah, I think as amazing as it is when it comes to sound design, recording live, as soon as you work with audio files, WAV files, it's amazing. But it still lacks a bit of MIDI. So I find Logic a lot easier, and also the score editor, where I can quickly print out a score sheet and hand it to the musician and say, okay, have a go at that, try this line, okay, no, let's change it. Then, it's quite easy if you have a musician in the studio.
Yeah.
So I think for that kind of functionality, Logic still is, for me, the platform to go to. but as soon as things are going to be recorded properly, then Pro Tools is the door to go to.
So you're printing out, from Logic, you're printing out the scores that then the live musicians are playing from?
If it's only one person and he's with me or she's with me in the studio, then yes. If it's a proper session, I would hand it to the orchestrator to make sure that it's written in such a way that it's easy and to digest for the musicians.
Yeah. And not least of which all the transpositions,
yeah.
especially for all the brass.
Yeah.
Is it 3 up, 2 down? Yeah.
Had this a few times. No, you can't risk that. Yeah.
Yeah. So no, orchestrator, they know it all. Yeah.
Especially
Absolutely.
towards the end when you're still editing cues and there could be a change in the edit, or maybe director wants you to write more music than anticipated in the first place. So instead of orchestrating yourself, you had it there anyway, but it's just a way of getting it onto score sheets so the musicians can read it properly. And in that time, I'd rather spend this time and write new music if I have to.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your time. Much appreciated. This has been Mike Thornton for Pro Tools Expert at Jigsaw's HQ in London.